A regular day until it wasn't. The automatic doors of Fairway Market slid open with a soft whoosh, releasing a breath of cool, air-conditioned relief onto the customers stepping inside. The late afternoon sun painted long shadows across the parking lot as people trickled in. Some alone, some with children, others in pairs, all moving with the steady rhythm of an ordinary day. Inside, the store buzzed with activity. The aisles hummed with the familiar sounds of shopping carts rolling over polished tiles, the occasional beep of barcodes being scanned at registers, and the soft chatter of shoppers discussing dinner plans or comparing labels. At the entrance, a display of fresh flowers greeted customers, their vibrant colors standing in contrast to the sterile brightness of the supermarket. Near the produce section, an elderly man picked through the apples, rolling them in his hands as if weighing their worth. A woman with a fussy toddler balanced on her hip frowned at her grocery list, muttering under her breath about forgetting something. A teenager in a high school hoodie dragged his feet behind his mother, earbuds wedged firmly in his ears, barely acknowledging her questions about which brand of cereal he preferred. It was a normal day. A completely forgettable day. Until it wasn't. Kevin stood in aisle 6, aligning the boxes of cereal with practiced precision. He was dressed in his neatly pressed store uniform, a blue polo tucked into khaki pants, and a name tag pinned securely to his chest. His short brown hair was combed neatly, his shoes were spotless, and the expression on his face was one of quiet concentration. At 28 years old, Kevin had been working at Fairway Market for nearly 2 years. He loved his job, took pride in it. Every task, no matter how small, was important to him. Stocking shelves wasn't just about putting products on display. It was about making things easy for customers, about keeping the store looking neat and welcoming. His favorite part of the job, though, was helping people. Whether it was guiding an elderly shopper to the right aisle or offering a child a sticker at checkout, Kevin always found joy in the little things. He had a warm presence, the kind that made people feel comfortable. Most of the regulars knew him by name. Some stopped to chat, asking about his day or complimenting his work. Others simply nodded in greeting. It was the kind of quiet acknowledgement that meant something to him, proof that he was part of the community. Kevin was humming softly as he worked, carefully adjusting a box of Cheerios so that it lined up perfectly with the others. He stepped back, examined his work, and nodded in satisfaction before turning toward the front of the store. The checkout area was a different kind of busy. Some registers had long lines, customers shifting impatiently as they waited their turn. Others moved more smoothly, the cashiers quick and efficient. At Register 4, Jordan, a college student working the summer shift, was scanning items for an older woman who was fumbling through her purse for coupons. Register 2 had a mother with a crying baby, trying her best to juggle her groceries and soothe her child at the same time. And then, at Register 3 stood her. Kevin didn't recognize the woman. She wasn't a regular. She looked to be in her late 40s, well-dressed but impatient, her fingers tapping against the checkout belt in a steady rhythm of irritation. Her dark hair was pulled into a tight bun, her eyebrows slightly furrowed as she glanced at her phone. Her basket wasn't overflowing, just a few essentials. Milk, bread, eggs, a bag of apples. Nothing complicated, but the way she was standing, her posture rigid and her mouth set in a thin line, made it clear that she was in no mood for delays. Kevin took a deep breath and stepped forward, flashing his usual friendly smile. "Hi there. Did you find everything okay today?" His voice was warm, inviting, the kind that could put anyone at ease. But not her. The woman barely spared him a glance. Her eyes remained on her phone as she responded with a curt, "Yeah, just ring it up." Kevin didn't let it bother him. He was used to all kinds of customers, some talkative, some quiet, some in a hurry. He moved efficiently, scanning each item with care. He placed the milk and eggs gently in the paper bag, then paused to check the top of the egg carton, making sure none were cracked. That was when it happened. "Oh my God, can you hurry it up? It's not that complicated." The words snapped across the checkout lane like a whip. Sharp, irritated, loud enough that a few nearby customers turned their heads. Kevin blinked, startled, but quickly resumed bagging. His hands moved a little faster, careful not to make any mistakes. But the woman wasn't done. She sighed dramatically, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "Jesus, this is taking forever," she muttered under her breath, but loud enough for him to hear. Kevin didn't respond. He just kept going, because that was what he always did. The store didn't stop. People kept shopping, kept moving. But there was a shift, a subtle change in the air, the kind that happens when something uncomfortable unfolds in a public space. At Register 5, a teenage girl who had been scrolling through her phone lowered it slightly, glancing over. A man in line at the self-checkout raised an eyebrow. Kevin swallowed, his hand steady as he tucked a loaf of bread into the bag. But then the woman spoke again. And this time, she didn't mutter. This time, she said it. Figures. Just one word. Simple, but dripping with something cold. Dismissive. Kevin froze. He didn't look up. He didn't react. He just kept moving. Because he knew what she meant. The store wasn't loud, but it wasn't silent either. It was that middle ground where people noticed things but didn't always step in. Where discomfort settled into the air, thick and suffocating. Kevin had dealt with this before. Maybe not always as direct, but the meaning was the same. The impatience, the judgment, the little looks that told him he was less. He didn't cry. Not here. Not now. He just did what he always did, kept going. He wiped up the small mess she made. He scanned the rest of her items. His hands were a little less steady, his heartbeat a little heavier. But he kept going. And the rest of the store. They were watching now. A woman at the next register, a grandmotherly figure with soft white hair, whispered something under her breath. Jordan, the yum cashier, shifted uncomfortably. And then it happened. Angela, the woman, rolled her eyes and reached for her cart. "Oh, forget it," she snapped. "I'll just go to another line. This is ridiculous." She turned, ready to leave. But someone else wasn't ready to let it go. From the far end of the counter, a voice cut through the tension like a blade. "That's enough." The voice wasn't angry, but it was firm, commanding. Angela stopped. Slowly, she turned. And that was when she saw him. Mr. Daniels, the owner of Fairway Market. He had been standing just a few feet away the entire time, watching, listening, and now he was stepping forward. Angela had no idea what was coming next, but she was about to find out. A line drawn in the sand. The supermarket had gone quiet. Not silent. There was still the faint hum of refrigerators, the occasional beep from another checkout lane, the shuffling of feet, but the kind of quiet that signaled something important was about to happen. Angela stood frozen in place, fingers tightening around the handle of her cart. Her face, once filled with irritation, flickered with something else, something almost like disbelief. Her sharp, confident stance wavered for just a moment as she took in the man now standing directly in front of her. Mr. Daniels. To most shoppers, he was just the store owner, a middle-aged man who spent more time in the back office than out on the floor. But to his employees, he was something else, a leader, a protector. And he had heard everything. Angela's lips parted slightly, as if to say something, but nothing came out. She blinked, as if recalibrating the situation, her body adjusting to the realization that she was suddenly at the center of attention. Mr. Daniels didn't move right away. He stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable, his presence commanding in a way that didn't need words. Kevin stood behind a register, eyes lowered, hands still resting lightly on the counter. His shoulders were stiff, his fingers fidgeting just slightly at his sides. He wasn't looking at Angela anymore. Instead, he was staring down at the conveyor belt, like he wished he could disappear into it. Mr. Daniels exhaled slowly through his nose before finally speaking. I said, he repeated, his voice even but firm. That's enough. Angela scoffed, shaking her head. Oh, come on, she muttered, her irritation bubbling back to the surface. Are we really doing this? Over a checkout line? Mr. Daniels didn't flinch, his voice didn't rise, but the weight behind his words made it clear that this wasn't a conversation she was going to win. I don't care how much of a hurry you're in, he said. What I do care about is how you treat the people in this store, and the way you just spoke to my employee. That's not how we do things here. Angela narrowed her eyes, shifting her weight onto one hip. Oh, please, she said, rolling her eyes. You're being ridiculous. All I did was tell him to hurry up. It's a checkout line, not a therapy session. A few feet away, a man near the self-checkout audibly sucked in a breath. An older woman from a different aisle turned slightly, brows furrowed. People who had only been half listening before were fully paying attention now. Mr. Daniels' expression didn't change. He was calm, measured, but there was something behind his eyes, something cold. Let's not play this game, he said, his voice quieter now, but somehow heavier. We both know exactly what you did. Angela let out a dry laugh, crossing her arms. Oh, give me a break. No, Mr. Daniels said simply. I won't. Angela's smirk faltered just slightly. Mr. Daniels tilted his head, his gaze unwavering. You think because you're in a hurry, because you're frustrated, that you can treat someone like they don't matter? He asked. You think it's okay to humiliate someone just because you don't think they can defend themselves? Angela's nostrils flared. I wasn't humiliating him. Yes, you were, Mr. Daniels interrupted. The store was dead silent now. Even the cashiers had slowed down. A few shoppers near the aisles were pretending to browse but weren't actually picking anything up. The air was thick with tension, the kind of weight that settled into people's chests when they realized they were witnessing something important. Angela scoffed again, her irritation turning into something more like embarrassment. Oh, come on. It's not that serious. Mr. Daniels exhaled sharply, shaking his head. That's the problem, he said. You don't think it's serious. Because for you, this is just another transaction. Just another moment in your day. But for him, he gestured toward Kevin, who was still standing stiffly behind the register. This is something he's lived with. Angela shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward Kevin for the first time since the confrontation began. Kevin still wasn't looking at her. His eyes were focused on the paper bag in front of him, his hands clasped together, his posture carefully neutral. Mr. Daniels let the silence hang for a second before he spoke again. I've been running this store for over 2 decades, he said, his voice lower now, steadier. I've seen all kinds of people walk through those doors. People who are kind. People who are patient. People who understand that treating others with dignity matters. He took a step closer. And then there are people like you. Angela bristled. Excuse me. Mr. Daniels didn't flinch, the kind who think their time is more important than someone else's humanity. A few people murmured softly, shifting their weight, exchanging glances. Angela let out another bitter laugh, but this one was thinner, more fragile. Oh, for God's sake, she snapped. I wasn't trying to dehumanize him. I just wanted to check out and get on with my day. He was taking forever. Mr. Daniels didn't blink. And, what's your rush? Angela blinked, caught off guard. What? What's your rush? Mr. Daniels repeated. Where do you have to be that justifies tearing someone else down? Angela opened her mouth, then closed it. Her fingers twitched around the handle of her cart. Mr. Daniels shook his head, disappointed. That's what I thought. Angela clenched her jaw. Look, I didn't mean to upset anyone, okay? I was just. No, Mr. Daniels cut in. You did mean it. And the only reason you're backtracking now is because people are watching. Angela's mouth snapped shut. The entire store was watching now. A woman near the dairy section had stopped mid-cart push, her expression unreadable. A teenage boy near the soda aisle was looking on, arms crossed. Angela let out a slow breath, rolling her shoulders back. "So what?" she said finally, her voice tight. "What, you want me to apologize?" Mr. Daniels studied her for a long moment, his face unreadable. "No," he said finally. "I want you to leave." Angela stiffened. "What?" "You heard me," Mr. Daniels said. "You're done shopping here." Angela stared at him as if she had misheard. Her face paled slightly, but then anger flared in her eyes. "You can't do that." Mr. Daniels raised an eyebrow. "Actually," he said smoothly, "I can." Angela let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Oh, this is insane," she muttered, shaking her head. "All of this over some clerk taking too long." "He's not just a clerk," Mr. Daniels said sharply, his patience finally wearing thin. "He's a human being. And in this store, we treat people with respect. If that's too much for you, then you can take your business somewhere else." Angela's fingers clenched around her cart. For the first time, she looked around, scanning the store, looking for some kind of support. But all she found were stony expressions, crossed arms, people waiting. No one was on her side. Angela swallowed. Then, with a stiff exhale, she yanked her purse from the cart, turned on her heel, and stormed toward the exit. No one stopped her. But just before she reached the door, Mr. Daniels called after her. "I hope someday you figure out why this happened." Angela hesitated, just for a second, and then she was gone. The doors slid shut behind her, and the store exhaled, the weight of a moment. The automatic doors slid shut behind Angela with a soft whoosh, leaving behind a store still thick with an emotion that was hard to name. Relief, satisfaction, unease. No one spoke for several long seconds. The tension had yet to fully dissipate, lingering like the ghost of a storm that had just passed through. Customers who had been watching slowly turned back to their carts, back to their shopping, but their movements were slower, more deliberate. It was as if the air still held the residue of what had just happened. Kevin, still standing at Register 3, felt it most of all. His hands rested lightly on the counter, fingers pressing against the cool surface, grounding himself. He hadn't looked up once since the confrontation had begun. Not at Angela, not at Mr. Daniels, not at the growing crowd of onlookers. He had simply focused on the work in front of him. The groceries, the bags, the motions he had repeated thousands of times before. That had been his way of coping. And yet, he still felt it. The weight of every word, every insult, every ounce of judgment that had been thrown his way. Because this wasn't the first time. People thought he didn't notice, that he didn't hear the sighs when he took a second too long to count change, that he didn't see the impatient foot taps when he double-checked a barcode, that he didn't feel the shift in energy when customers thought he wasn't moving fast enough. He noticed. He always noticed. It had just become easier to pretend he didn't. But today was different, because today, for the first time, someone had actually stood up for him. And that was something he hadn't expected. Mr. Daniels finally broke the silence, exhaling as he turned toward Kevin. "You all right?" Kevin blinked, the words hitting him like a gentle nudge. His gaze flickered up for the first time, meeting Mr. Daniels' steady eyes. Kevin hesitated, unsure what to say. His throat felt tight. He wasn't used to being asked that question. "Are you all right?" No one usually asked. People assumed. They assumed that he was fine, that he was used to it, that he would just shake it off like he always did. But this time, it felt different. Because he wasn't fine. Not really. His fingers curled slightly against the countertop before he finally managed, "Yeah, I'm okay." Mr. Daniels studied him for a long moment before nodding. "All right." There was no pity in his gaze, no empty reassurances, no false comfort, just quiet understanding. Kevin appreciated that. A few registers over, Jordan, the young college student working the summer shift, was still staring at Mr. Daniels like he had just witnessed a superhero moment in real life. That was Jordan struggled to find the right word. That was cool. Mr. Daniels snorted, shaking his head. No, he corrected. That was necessary. Jordan nodded slowly, as if letting the meaning settle in. A few feet away, a woman stepped forward in line. She was older, her silver hair neatly pinned back, her expression kind. She set a carton of orange juice on the conveyor belt and looked directly at Kevin. "You did a good job today," she said simply. Kevin blinked, startled by the directness of it. It was such a small sentence, just 5 words. But they landed heavier than anything else. A good job. Not in spite of what happened, but because of it. Kevin swallowed hard and nodded. "Thank you," he said softly. And this time, he meant it. The store slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Shoppers continued their routines. The beeps of barcodes being scanned resumed. The low chatter of conversations picked up again. It was as if nothing had happened. And yet, something had changed. Kevin could feel it. Because now, when he looked up, people met his gaze. Not out of pity, not out of awkwardness, but because, for once, they saw him. Not just as an employee, not just as a task to be completed, a transaction to be hurried along. They saw him. And that was something new. Outside, in the parking lot, Angela sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She hadn't left yet. Her keys were in the ignition. The engine was running. And yet, she just sat there, because she couldn't stop hearing his words. "I hope someday you figure out why this happened." Angela clenched her jaw. She wanted to shake it off, to dismiss it, to tell herself that this was stupid, that it had all been blown out of proportion. But something about it stuck. Something about it wouldn't leave her. Because deep down, beneath the layers of frustration and pride, a quiet, unwelcome thought crept in. Was I really that out of line? Angela exhaled sharply, glaring at her reflection in the rearview mirror. She hated that this was still bothering her. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't make it go away. Because for the first time in a long time, Angela wasn't entirely sure if she had been right. And that was a feeling she didn't know how to handle. Inside the store, Kevin continued working. The shift wasn't over yet, and there were still groceries to bag. Still customers to help. Still work to be done. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. Because today, someone had stood up for him. And that mattered. The echo of a moment. Angela's fingers drummed against the steering wheel, her breath slow and steady, but her chest felt tight. She had been sitting in the supermarket parking lot for almost 10 minutes now, watching the slow rhythm of people moving in and out of the store. She wasn't sure why she hadn't left yet. The keys were in the ignition. The engine hummed softly beneath her, but she just sat there. Because she couldn't stop hearing it. "I hope someday you figure out why this happened." Mr. Daniels' words looped in her mind like a stubborn radio station that refused to tune out. She scoffed, shaking her head. "Figure out what exactly?" "That some cashier took too long bagging my groceries. That I had every right to be frustrated." And yet, she knew that wasn't really what had happened. She exhaled sharply, leaning her head back against the seat. The entire thing had started as something so small, a minor inconvenience, a simple annoyance, but somehow it had spiraled into something bigger, something that made the entire store turn on her, something that made her feel like she was the villain. Was she? Angela didn't like the question, didn't like that she was asking it, because she wasn't the kind of person who second-guessed herself. She was efficient. She was direct. She didn't waste time with unnecessary pleasantries. So why did this feel different? She looked back through the glass doors of the supermarket. Kevin was still at his register, still working, still doing the exact same job as before. But something about the way he moved now, the way people approached him, the way they met his eyes and saw him, felt different. Angela turned away. Why am I still thinking about this? She gritted her teeth, forcing her hands to tighten on the wheel. Then, with a short breath, she put the car in drive. And yet, as she pulled out of the parking lot, that single, unwelcome thought remained. Maybe they weren't wrong. Kevin's new normal. Inside the store, Kevin didn't let himself think about what had happened. At least, he tried not to. He focused on the work. That was what he always did. He bagged the groceries carefully, lining them up just right. He made sure the eggs were secure, the bread wasn't crushed, the heavier items were balanced at the bottom of the bag. Routine. Normal. Safe. And yet, there was something new about today. Something that felt different. Because people were choosing his line. Not because it was the shortest. Not because they were in a hurry. But because they wanted to. It started small. A man in a blue flannel shirt stepped forward, placing his basket on the counter, offering Kevin a small nod as he unloaded his groceries. A woman with a toddler gave him a soft smile as she handed him a stack of items, murmuring a quiet, "Take your time." Little things. But Kevin noticed. Because he always noticed. And maybe, just maybe, this time, it meant something. Mr. Daniels lingered near the front of the store, arms crossed, watching. Not because he expected anything more to happen, but because he wanted to see. To make sure Kevin was okay. To make sure that what happened mattered. He had been running this store for years, long enough to know that moments like these, ones that seemed small, insignificant to some, had weight, had consequences, and sometimes, the best thing a person could do was make sure that weight was carried by the right people. Not by the ones who had been hurt, but by the ones who had caused the hurt in the first place. His gaze flickered toward the parking lot. He saw Angela's car finally pull away, her tires crunching against the asphalt as she disappeared from view. Would she forget about this? Would she move on? Or would it stay? Would it sit in her chest, the way moments like this were supposed to? Mr. Daniels didn't know, but he hoped. A conversation that meant more than it seemed. Jordan, the young cashier, still hadn't shaken off what happened. He moved through the motions of scanning items, but his thoughts kept drifting back to what he had seen, to what he had felt. Finally, when his lane was empty, he turned toward Mr. Daniels. "Hey," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Can I ask you something?" Mr. Daniels raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead." Jordan hesitated, then sighed. "Why did you do that?" Mr. Daniels frowned. "Do what?" Jordan gestured toward Kevin's register. "Step in like that. Say something. Most people wouldn't have." Mr. Daniels studied him for a long moment, then exhaled. "I did it," he said, "because it needed to be done." Jordan nodded slowly, but his expression remained thoughtful. "But like, why you?" Mr. Daniels' gaze drifted toward Kevin. He saw the way Kevin moved, the way he carefully handed a woman her bag of groceries, the way his hands still had the smallest hint of nervousness to them. Because this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Because Kevin wasn't used to people standing up for him. And that wasn't okay. Mr. Daniels looked back at Jordan and sighed. "You ever hear the saying, 'If not me, then who?'" he asked. Jordan frowned. "Yeah, that's why," Mr. Daniels said simply. Jordan blinked. Then, slowly, he nodded. And maybe he understood. The ripple effect. Angela sat at a red light, drumming her fingers against her knee. She shouldn't still be thinking about it. She shouldn't still feel like something had shifted. But she did. She clenched her jaw, gripping the steering wheel tighter. Because for the first time in a long time, she had to ask herself a question she didn't like. When was the last time I thought about someone other than myself? The light turned green. Angela exhaled and pressed the gas. But she knew this wasn't over. Not yet. A fractured reflection. Angela drove through town, past familiar streets and stores, her mind a tangled mess of frustration and something she refused to name. Guilt. No, that wasn't it. She hadn't done anything wrong, had she? Her hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter as she pulled into her driveway. The house was quiet when she stepped inside. Too quiet. She usually welcomed the silence after a long day. But today, it felt suffocating. She tossed her purse onto the kitchen counter and moved on autopilot, opening the fridge, grabbing a bottle of water. The motion was routine, comfortable, but her mind wasn't, because he was still there. Kevin. The look on his face. The way he never argued, never fought back. The way he kept going as if the words didn't matter, even though she knew they had. Angela twisted the bottle cap open with more force than necessary, taking a long sip before slamming it down on the counter. She needed to stop thinking about this. This wasn't the first time she had snapped at someone. It wasn't the first time she had been impatient, or in a hurry, or frustrated. People got like that all the time. It was normal. So why? Why did this feel different? Why did it bother her? Angela sighed and made her way to the living room, sinking onto the couch. She pulled out her phone, instinctively opening social media, scrolling mindlessly, anything to distract herself. But it didn't work, because even as her thumb moved over the screen, she kept seeing his face. The quiet way he had swallowed the insult, the stiffness in his shoulders, the fact that he never once looked at her, and the worst part, that everyone else had. The old woman who had shaken her head in disapproval. The young cashier who looked like he wanted to say something but didn't know how. The customers who had stared at her like she was the problem. For the first time, in a long time, Angela realized something. She had been the problem. She didn't like that thought. Didn't like the way it made her chest tighten, the way it made her stomach twist. Because if she accepted it, if she admitted it, then she had to ask herself the question she had been avoiding since she walked out of that store. Why am I like this? Angela clenched her jaw and tossed the phone onto the couch beside her. She leaned forward, pressing the heels of her hands against her eyes. Because she already knew the answer. She had been like this for a long time. Impatient, sharp-tongued, always in a hurry. She had spent years convincing herself that it was just who she was. That the world didn't wait for slow people. That if you weren't fast, if you weren't efficient, if you weren't perfect, you got left behind. And maybe, just maybe, that was why she had been so angry at Kevin. Not because he was slow, but because he didn't care about speed the way she did. Because he still smiled. Because he still tried. Because he still showed up. And because, deep down, Angela invited that. She sucked in a slow breath, rubbing her temples. And for the first time, she let herself wonder, when did I stop being kind? And more importantly, could I still change? Meanwhile, back at Fairway Market, Kevin's shift was almost over. The store had settled back into its usual rhythm, but he still felt the lingering weight of what had happened. Not in a bad way. Not in a good way, either. Just in a way. Something had changed today. He didn't know what, not exactly, but he could feel it. People had noticed him. Not just as an employee, not just as the guy at Register 3, but as a person. And that was new. As he finished bagging the customer's groceries, an older man in a button-up shirt gave him a nod. "Hey, son," the man said, pausing before grabbing his bags. "I just wanted to say, you handled yourself real well today." Kevin blinked. The man offered a small smile. "That woman was way out of line. But you didn't let it shake you. That's something to be proud of." Kevin felt something in his chest tighten, something he didn't quite have a name for. He didn't know what to say. So he just nodded. And the man nodded back. "Have a good night," he said, grabbing his bags and heading for the door. Kevin exhaled slowly, watching him go. Maybe, just maybe, today had meant something. Angela's decision. Angela hadn't moved from the couch in over an hour. She hated this, hated that she was lingering on it, hated that something so small, a single moment, a single choice, was still eating at her, but she also knew why. Because it wasn't small. Because it had mattered. And because, for the first time in years, Angela had been forced to look at herself. And she didn't like what she saw. Her gaze flickered toward her car keys, still sitting on the counter. Her heart thudded once. She knew what she had to do. She didn't want to do it. But maybe that was the point. Angela pushed herself up from the couch, grabbing her keys with a quick, decisive motion. And then, before she could talk herself out of it, she headed for the door. She had somewhere to be. A step toward change. Angela sat in her car outside Fairway Market, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The parking lot was quieter now, the evening rush having tapered off. The neon OPEN sign in the window cast a faint glow on the sidewalk. She hadn't planned to come back. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. But here she was. Her heart thudded against her ribs, an unfamiliar feeling creeping through her, one she couldn't quite place. Nervousness. Regret. Fear. What if I walk in and they just stare at me? What if they laugh? What if they don't care? She inhaled sharply. You don't have to do this. You can just drive home. Forget this ever happened. And yet, she knew she wouldn't forget. She had spent years pretending that her words, her impatience, her attitude didn't have consequences, that they slid off people like water off a windshield. But Kevin's face had stuck with her, not because he had yelled, not because he had fought back, but because he hadn't, because he had simply absorbed it. And that was what had unsettled her the most. Angela clenched her jaw, staring through the windshield. Just get out of the car. Just do it. She let out a slow breath, reached for the door handle, and hesitated. Her pride screamed at her to stop, to turn around, go home, and let it go. But something deeper, something that she had buried for a long time, told her that if she left now, she wouldn't just be walking away from this moment. She would be walking away from a chance to be better. And for the first time in years, she wanted to take it. Inside the store, Kevin stood behind his register, scanning the last few items for a customer. His shift was almost over. The day had been long, longer than usual, but not because of the work, because of everything else, because of what had happened, because of what it had meant. He had felt something shift today. People had looked at him differently, not with pity, not with awkwardness, but with recognition. Like they had seen what happened, like they understood something they hadn't before. And that had meant more than he could put into words. But now, as the last of the customers filtered out, Kevin let himself breathe. Tomorrow, things would probably go back to normal. And that was okay. Because today had still mattered. And then, the automatic doors slid open, and she walked in. Kevin's breath hitched. Angela. For a second, he thought maybe he was imagining it, that she was just another customer, here to grab something she had forgotten. But then, she hesitated, right by the entrance, like she wasn't sure if she should be here. Kevin felt his chest tighten. He had seen plenty of people come and go in this store, but he had never seen this. Angela's shoulders rose and fell with a slow breath. Then, deliberately, she walked toward his register. Kevin's pulse thumped in his ears. He didn't know what to expect. Was she going to be angry? Was she going to demand to speak to the manager? Was she going to act like nothing had happened? But when she stopped in front of the counter, she didn't look angry. She just looked tired. And maybe, just maybe, a little uncertain. For a long second, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Angela cleared her throat. She trailed off, exhaling sharply before starting again. I was out of line earlier. Kevin's fingers twitched slightly, but he didn't move. I shouldn't have snapped at you, Angela continued. Her voice was quieter than before, less sharp. I was rude, and impatient, and wrong. The words seemed to cost her something, but she said them anyway. Kevin swallowed. He hadn't expected this. People didn't do this. Not to him. Not for him. Angela shifted on her feet, as if debating whether to keep going. Then, with a hesitant breath, she added, "I'm sorry." Kevin blinked. It was the first time she had looked him in the eyes. And for the first time, she actually saw him. He opened his mouth, then closed it, because he didn't know what to say. He had spent so many years learning to move on, to let things go. But this was new. Angela frowned slightly. "I know that probably doesn't fix anything. And I'm not expecting you to forgive me or anything like that. I wanted to say it, because you didn't deserve that." Kevin exhaled slowly. The weight of the day, the words, the moment, it all pressed against him. He glanced past Angela, toward the store entrance, where Mr. Daniel stood a few feet away, watching. He wasn't interfering, wasn't stepping in, because this time, it wasn't his battle to fight. It was Kevin's. Kevin turned back to Angela. He studied her for a long moment. She was still standing stiffly, as if ready for him to tell her off, as if she expected him to be angry. And maybe a part of him should be. Maybe another version of him, a younger version, a version that had been hurt more times than he could count, would be. But Kevin had never been the kind of person to hold on to anger. So instead, he just nodded. And then, quietly, simply, he said, "Thank you." Angela's shoulders sagged slightly, like she had been bracing for something worse. But when Kevin didn't say anything else, didn't reject her, didn't push her away, she nodded back. And for the first time all day, she felt like she could breathe. A new understanding. Angela didn't stay long after that. She didn't need to. She had done what she came to do. And when she stepped out of the store, into the cool night air, she felt something shift inside her. Something small. Something quiet. But something real. Because for the first time in a long time, she had actually seen the weight of her words, and she knew. She didn't want to be that person anymore. Angela pulled out her keys, unlocking her car. As she slid into the driver's seat, she caught one last glimpse of the store. Through the glass doors, Kevin was still at his register, still working, still himself, and for the first time since that afternoon, she didn't look away. Because today had changed her, and maybe, just maybe, that meant something too. The beginning of something new. Angela drove home in silence. No music, no podcasts, no distractions, just the quiet hum of the engine and the weight of her own thoughts. The streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement as she turned onto her block. The neighborhood was still, windows glowing warmly against the night. She pulled into her driveway, shut off the engine, and just sat there. Her hands rested on the wheel, fingers curled loosely. She should feel better. She had done what she came to do. She had gone back. She had apologized. And Kevin, he had accepted it. Not with some grand gesture, not with resentment, just with a quiet, simple thank you. And somehow, that had been enough. So why did she still feel like something was unfinished? Angela sighed, rubbing a hand over her face. Because it was unfinished. Because saying sorry wasn't enough if nothing changed. And she knew, deep in her chest, that if she didn't make a change, this moment would fade. She would slip back into the same patterns, the same impatience, the same sharp words and quick judgments. And someday, she might not even remember Kevin's face. And that wasn't good enough. Angela wasn't sure how long she sat there, staring at the dashboard. But eventually she moved. She grabbed her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen before she typed something into the search bar. How to be more patient. It was stupid. It was small. But it was a start. And for the first time, Angela realized she wanted to be better. Not because she had to, but because she needed to. The morning after, Kevin's alarm buzzed at 6:00 a.m. sharp. He blinked against the soft glow of his bedside lamp, exhaling slowly before sitting up. Another day. The events of the previous afternoon were still fresh in his mind. Angela. Mr. Daniels. The moment when everything had shifted. Kevin had spent years learning to let things roll off his back, to push forward, to keep working, to keep going. But yesterday had been different, because yesterday someone had stood up for him. And even more surprising, someone had come back. Kevin still wasn't sure what to make of that. People didn't come back. They didn't apologize. Not to him. And yet, Angela had. And something about that mattered. He wasn't sure why, but it did. He pulled himself out of bed, stretching as he moved through his morning routine. By the time he was dressed and ready, the sky outside had shifted from deep blue to pale gold. Kevin grabbed his store uniform and shrugged it on. Another shift. Another day. But this time, maybe, just maybe, something had changed. Fairway Market. A different kind of day. Angela walked through the supermarket doors at exactly 8:15 a.m. This time, there was no rush. No hurried steps, no irritated sighs. Just the quiet understanding that she was here. And she was paying attention. She grabbed a cart, rolling it slowly toward the produce section. She moved differently today. Not just physically, but in a way that felt lighter. She caught herself watching the employees as they worked, noticing details she had never bothered with before. The way the young cashier at Register 4 smiled at an elderly woman as he helped her with her bags. The way a stock boy in the frozen aisle carefully rearranged the shelves, making sure every item was in its proper place. The way Kevin, at Register 3, greeted a customer with that same quiet warmth she had once ignored. She hadn't really seen it before, because she had never looked. But now she saw it everything. Angela exhaled, reaching for a bag of apples. One small step, one small choice, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was running. She didn't feel like she was rushing through life. She felt present, and that was everything. Kevin notices. Kevin wasn't sure if he was imagining it, but something about Angela seemed different. She wasn't moving with that same stiff, impatient energy. She wasn't tapping her fingers on the cart handle. She wasn't sighing as if the world was constantly in her way. She was just there, present. And when she finally made her way to his register, Kevin did something he had never done before. He met her gaze. And this time, she met his. "Hey, Kevin," she said. It was the first time she had said his name. And it landed differently. Kevin blinked, processing the simple greeting before nodding. "Hey, Angela." She placed her groceries on the counter, watching as he scanned them with the same careful attention he always gave. And this time, she didn't rush him. She just waited. Kevin noticed. And for the first time since yesterday, he smiled. The ripple effect. Angela left the store feeling different. Not fixed. Not perfect. Not suddenly transformed into a better version of herself. But different. Because today, she had chosen something new. She had seen something new. And that meant everything. As she walked through the parking lot, she glanced back one last time, just in time to see Kevin handing a bag of groceries to a little boy, who giggled as Kevin gave him a sticker. Angela felt something in her chest tighten. Because if someone like Kevin, someone who had been knocked down time and time again, could keep choosing kindness, then maybe so could she. And maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. Angela climbed into her car, resting her hands lightly on the wheel. And for the first time in a long, long time, she didn't feel angry. She didn't feel impatient. She just felt ready to change. And that was more than enough.